how dangerous are air shows? There's an average of over 300 air shows every year in the United States, but how many of those actually result in tragedy? And how have the rules changed over the years to make them safer? We're going to take a look at some of the biggest air show disasters in history, and I'm going to share with you what no one tells you about air shows. Over 10 million people attend air shows every year in the United States, and these are a great opportunity to see modern military fighter jets such as the F-35, the F-22, and the infamous United States Air Force Thunderbirds, as well as the United States Navy Blue Angels. But the shows are also a unique chance to see heritage aircraft from World War II. Sometimes air shows can result in disaster, and no, this isn't photoshopped. This ejection was caught on camera during an air show at Mountain Home Air Force Base in 2003, and here's what happened. The pilot began his maneuver shortly after takeoff, but unfortunately he began that maneuver too low to the ground, and he was able to eject just prior to impact. By the way, my name is Trevor Smith. I flew the F-15E Strike Eagle in the Air Force and also did an exchange program flying the F-18 with the Marine Corps. And this channel is all about aviation, so be sure to subscribe so you don't miss any new content. Fortunately, the pilot in that last clip ejected safely and no spectators were injured, but sadly that's not always the case. In 1951, on a sunny day in Flagler, Colorado, a pilot performing at the Fall Day Festival crashed into the crowd when he attempted to perform a loop at 200 feet over the spectators. 20 people were killed, including the pilot and 13 children in the crowd. Now, the pilot had reportedly arrived late to the air show that day, and he missed the safety briefing that actually prohibited flying below 500 feet, and they had briefed that they weren't to perform any stunts near the crowd. At the time this happened, this was the worst airshow disaster in U.S. history. Now, the following year in 1952, at the Farnborough Air Show in England, two pilots put a prototype aircraft into a supersonic dive, pulling out just short of the airfield and the 120,000 spectators, and then on their next high-speed pass, as the aircraft rolled wings level, it experienced a structural failure and essentially disintegrated in less than a second in front of the crowd, killing the two pilots, and the resulting debris killed 29 people and injured 60 others. One thing that no one tells you is that these two incidents, along with some other mishaps in the 1950s, were ultimately what led to the FAA implementing a pretty drastic series of safety rules for all the air shows in the US. And as a direct result of those rules, there actually wouldn't be another spectator death at an air show in the US until 2011, but we'll talk about that incident in a minute. First, you need to know that the pilots participating in these air shows aren't just any regular pilots. Just because you have a lot of flight time doesn't mean you're qualified to participate in an air show. According to the FAA, in order to participate in an air show, the pilots that perform, they have to have a special certificate and they have to abide by all of the limitations on that certificate. They also have to provide proof that they have performed or practiced within the previous 45 days. And when it comes to military pilots, they must have command approval and FAA approval to conduct a demonstration in accordance with an approved maneuvers package. And as a former military pilot, let me just say that all these pilots, they're hand-selected and they train specifically for these performances, especially if we're talking about the Blue Angels or the Thunderbirds. Unfortunately, even the best pilots can still make mistakes. And this brings us to the air show disaster that took place at Ramstein Air Base in 1988. Now, this footage might be hard to watch for some.
The accident occurred at Ramstein Air Base during a controversial air show. An Italian acrobatic team, the Tricolori, or Tricolor Arrows, tried to execute a difficult maneuver when something went wrong.
Ultimately, 3 pilots and 67 spectators died, and another 346 spectators sustained serious injuries. The investigation revealed that the aircraft that caused the mishap was flying too low and too fast. Basically, he wasn't where he was supposed to be, and the pilot was unable to correct the mistake in time. This incident really drove home for the FAA the importance of show lines in air shows. Now, it's hard to tell from the ground as a spectator because you can't really see them, but what no one tells you is that there are 3 show lines on the ground that pilots use when they're flying around in order to keep a minimum distance from the crowd during their performance. Category 3 aircraft are those that are slower than 156 knots, and they're required to keep a minimum distance of 500 feet from the crowd. Category 2 aircraft are going to be speeds from 156 up to 245 knots, and that's at 1,000 feet from the crowd. And Category 3 aircraft are going to be all of your fast jets, or basically anything faster than 245 knots, and they're pushed back to 1,500 feet away from the crowd. Unfortunately, rules are a little different overseas, and 14 years after the Ramstein crash, there was another airshow accident that is now known as the deadliest airshow in history. The accident took place on 27 July 2002 when a Ukrainian Su-27 crashed while trying to perform a low-altitude rolling maneuver. The aircraft cartwheeled into the crowd of spectators, killing 77 and injuring another 100. Both pilots managed to eject and survive. Ultimately, the pilots were blamed, but the pilots also put some blame on the organizers for not allowing them additional training to practice, and they also blamed the organizers for planning the show so close to the spectators, stating that the show had planned for them to directly overfly the spectators. Another thing that no one tells you about air shows is the role of the air boss. Now, if you don't know who this is, they're basically the one in charge of all the aircraft during the show and oversee pretty much everything. Now, just like the pilots performing in the show, the air boss is required to have special certifications, undergo training, as well as have recency of experience. Most airports or military bases that host air shows don't necessarily have someone sitting around that meets all these requirements, so they're often contracted out to a select group of individuals that do. One thing that we haven't talked about yet is aircraft maintenance, and then I'm going to explain the most important thing you need to know about air shows. Unfortunately, this brings us to the 2011 air show crash in Reno, Nevada. Now, in this air show, the investigation found that the probable cause was essentially a flight control malfunction that resulted in over 17 Gs of force on the aircraft, which almost certainly rendered the pilot unconscious. The pilot and 10 others on the ground died as a result of the accident. But the one thing that you might not know is that the NTSB came out with 7 new safety recommendations that would be applied to all future air races. They moved the course further away from spectators and required pre-race inspections to include evidence of any aircraft modifications to be reviewed. Now, when it comes to aircraft maintenance, I know a lot of people say that some of the aircraft performing in these air shows are too old and shouldn't be flying anymore, especially some of the vintage World War II aircraft. But here's what no one tells you about that. The older aircraft that are used to perform in air shows typically undergo more maintenance and routine checks than other aircraft. This doesn't mean that they're broken or they're unsafe. It just means that the performers understand the age of the aircraft and they pay careful attention to ensure the aircraft is properly maintained and safe for flight. I mean, just think about it. It's not like they have a regular parts supply for a P-51 aircraft sitting around. So everything pretty much has to be custom made. And that means in most cases, the parts they are using are actually better than some of the original parts on the aircraft. And the end result is that it is extremely rare to hear about an airshow mishap that was solely due to the mechanical failure of the aircraft. That's why the most important thing to know is that although airshows will always involve a certain level of risk, it's extremely low and it shouldn't keep you from attending. The aviation industry accounts for over 5% of our annual GDP, and airshows do a great amount of good in terms of improving relations with the public and inspiring the next generation of aviators. And if you like this video, be sure to check out this one on the screen here, and I'll see you next time.